Bang! Neeves Knives. I'm Jared. My lovely wife, Kara, is at work. And today we're doing a knife talk. Or actually, well, I'm probably going to post this tomorrow. So, actually, technically, we're on our way out of town. But, as of right now, when I'm filming this... anyways, knife talk video. So, how long is a knife going to last you? So... you know, that's a big spectrum, right? So I kind of broke it down, and first I'm going to talk about a few details that that you have to consider before adding up the time and everything else. And at the end of this video, I actually did break it down to about what I think it should be. So also, I just want to say that I got this idea from Jersey Knife Guy. He left a comment in one of my videos and it gave me this idea. So huge thank you to him. Please go check his channel out. I will link him in the description. Thank you, bud. First up, we got to talk about a few things. I'm trying to say the names of knives when I bring them up. I'm not sure if I'll get to all these knives or not, but I've got some budget knives here, I got some expensive knives here, I got some mid-grade knives, and I'm going to try to name them as I pull them up. This is the Rake P801 in 14C28N. Amazing budget knife. I think you can get these for about 30 bucks. And just a good looking knife too. So first up, it's not always about the price you spend, but it could possibly be about the company you're using or the company that makes the knife. And it's not always about the company you buy from. Sometimes it is vice versa. It's about the money you spend. So sometimes it also depends on how long until you start using the knife, right? Because a lot of us get a knife and we're scared to scratch it at first, right? We get it and we don't want to use it right away. This is the Ganzo FH12. Very good looking knife also. So we get it, we don't want to mess it up. So, you know, we might fidget with it for a few weeks and then eventually start using it. And sometimes you just get a knife and you just start using it. That's what you got it for. You got it to use. But I think, you know, like a lot of us have that little break-in period, the honeymoon phase. So, but I think the honeymoon phase is a good thing. I think it is smart to get a knife. All right, personally with me, I won't never buy a knife and just start using it. Like, so I'll buy a knife and I make sure I get in at least 100 flips before well, I mean, I might cut like a bag or something, you know, like light stuff. But I mean, like actually cutting through thick cardboard and using the locking mechanism and everything. I'll make sure I get at least 100 flips out of it first. And that could just be me, and it might not matter at all. But I feel like personally that a lock bar needs to break in to an area that basically where it's strong and comfortable. I've gotten knives before where, oh, this was the QSP Penguin. I've gotten knives before that I bought and the lock bar wasn't fully engaged, right? So like if I locked it up real hard, right, and it would lock up, but if I slow rolled it, it wouldn't lock up. Like I could almost unlock it just by pushing on it, just because the lock bar had to break in. But then after me flicking and flicking and flicking, the lock bar did settle into a good place. Now, sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes you just need to send your knife back. But sometimes a lock bar does need to settle into a good place. So, but me personally, I think you should flip your knife, you know, a little bit before you start putting it through some hard use or anything like that. Also, I think, in my opinion, that you should... This is the Ganzo F750. I think you should let the use that you do build up over time. I don't think you should just buy a knife and just start cutting something ridiculous with it right off the bat. I think you should let it build up a little bit. You know, I don't mean like you have to let it go over a long period of time, but, you know, don't start off by cutting the most dense, hardest stuff possible. Build it up a little bit, you know, cut some cardboard, and first start off with cutting some lightweight stuff, then possibly some cardboard, and then after it's, you know, comfortable with cutting stuff, then maybe start putting it through some harder tasks, just so that the lock bar can kind of break into a nice, good place. Now, all this does also depend on the build quality, period. The hardware, the kind of hardware, how big the hardware is, and also the intended purpose, right? So you don't take a lightweight use knife. This is the CJRB RIA. You don't take a knife like this and use it for breaking down boxes all day or cardboard all day. This would be strictly an EDC knife, something that you take out, you use, you put back in your pocket. It's not a work knife. It's basically what I'm trying to say. So you got to use the knife for its intended purpose. But the hardware is going to be, in my opinion, a big factor. So like, depending on the weight of the blade, right? This is the Sanrem New Land. If I didn't say it, the 9011 or 910 in 12C27. I do really like this knife. This knife is awesome, but you want to make sure that the stop pin supports the weight of the blade. Like, you don't want a very tiny, thin stop pin for a big old heavy duty blade. And then the most important part, well, but let me back up really quick. Like I said about the hardware, you know, how thick the liners are, how big they are, do they cover the whole thing? You know, like I said, this is also based upon what type of work you're going to be doing with it. If it's just going to be a little office knife, then this might not matter. But if it's going to be a work knife or an EDC knife that you use for harder purposes, then you want to make sure your hardware is nice and big, or there's enough placements for it to be strong and durable, where it's not flexing and moving and shifting and stuff. And make sure there's enough hardware to where it doesn't expand and contract through hot and cold areas constantly, especially if you're the type of person that is in hot and cold areas, you know, like in and out of different areas and stuff, you know, depending on what you do. But the most important part, in my opinion, is the lock face. So depending on your lock bar, how it meets up with the tang of the blade, the lock face. So that is going to be the most important part, and that's why a lot of times I show that in my review. I don't know if this would be the best knife to show this on, but this is the Civivi Elementum in S35VN. So making sure that this lock bar locks up appropriately with the lock face. So now, let me find a different knife actually that can probably support this a little bit better. Okay, do you see? Let me use another knife to point stuff out. How right here, there's an angle. Okay, depending on this angle and how much it shifts and how much it angles, depending on how strong your lock bar is. So, because depending on how strong your lock bar is, depends on how fast it might move over. The ergos, depending on how hard when you're squeezing on it, do you put pressure on the lock bar? Now, is that angle a good enough angle to where it's not going to move over all the way? Now, like, if you look, everybody knows the Rat 1, this is the Rat 1. Now, it's kind of known for having late lockup. This one is about on its last leg. It's almost 100%. But even just regular ones, they usually sit about right here, and then the more you flick them, the more they wind up settling in, you know, like right about there normally. Now this one, the good flick, you see, It's almost at 100% lockup, but it's not quite there yet. But that's basically what I'm talking about, is how fast your lock bar is going to shift over. So your lock face has an angle like this. So there's a spot where it lands right here, and then it has an area to like shift over, and then there should be an angle right here to stop it from going 100%. Now if it's just a subtle incline or subtle angle, then it's going to move its way over pretty quickly. So all those things are, you know, you got to put into consideration when you get a knife. Look at those little details and see how they are. Now if your lock bar is very light, so like the pressure you have to push to disengage it, it's not always a bad thing, but sometimes that can end up leading to lock rock. And this one doesn't have it, but it does have a light lock bar. But I only use this for small EDC uses. I have used it hard for like the reviews and stuff like that, and you know, it's actually been beat on pretty hard, but it's fine as of right now. But a lot of knives can get lock rock. Now what you can do is you can bend your lock bar a little bit and get rid of it if it's just from that. But strength of a lock bar, now if you have a nice strong lock bar, you're going to be guaranteed a strong lockup, but you're also going to be guaranteed that your lock bar is moving over faster. So you want to make sure that that angle, the geometry of your lock face and lock bar are good together. Now there are different locks, like the compression lock. This is the Spyderco Shaman with the red micarta. Now this has a different type of lock. It has a compression lock that basically puts a liner in between the lock bar and the stop pin. So it's going to be a little bit harder for you to test that out, but that's a very strong lock. Just like an axis lock. An axis lock is a bar that this bar right here goes up behind the tang of the blade right here. It drops in. So this is a very, very strong lock. That's going to be a little different, and that puts tension a little different. And even if it does get a little bit of play, which this one doesn't have, it usually won't lead to lock failure because of the way the lock is. So it's not the type of lock like where a liner or a frame lock, if you're getting lock play and stuff, and if it's moving or shifting, or if you have room in between the lock or anything like that, where it can equal failure a little bit easier. So you definitely want to, you know what type of lock you have and what type of uses you're using your knife for, and that it's being used for its intended purposes, because there are knives that are supposed to be used hard use. There's knives that are, are made for a little bit of prying, and a lot of cutting, and, maybe a little bit harder use. This is the Hinder Jurassic. This is going to be a little bit more harder use of a knife. And you can tell that by the lock face geometry, how thick the lock bar is, how thick the blade is. And that's another thing. Oh yeah, also the stop pins. Look how big the stop pins are, where they lock up at. How far, if you put a little pressure on the lock bar, whether or not it moves over really fast. All those little things. And I'm not telling you to put pressure on your lock bar. I'm just saying, like, from squeezing, when you're squeezing your knife, putting it through materials, if all of a sudden you squeeze and you're putting through materials, and then now you got lock stick, and you got to like unlock your lock bar by putting a lot of pressure on it because it's moved over, well, that's going to cause problems. It's going to keep moving over. But blade geometry is going to be another thing too, because let's say everything holds up solid, right? But now you've sharpened the heck out of your steel, right? So the certain steels, right? So if M390 is going to last obviously longer than 440C. Sorry, this was the TS129, and but But yeah, so it's obviously going to last longer than 440C for the most part, usually. So it depends on how often you're sharpening it, the blade geometry, how thick it is, the type of use you're doing. But let's say you do all the intended purposes and you're using it accordingly. Okay, so this is the way I've figured it out. So you got a hard use knife, a light use knife, a medium use knife. So if you're using your knife for its intended purpose and you're not flicking your knife over and over and over and over. So like at a certain degree, some knives are good for fidgeting. They're okay to fidget with. But some knives are going to, depending on that lock face geometry and everything, like say the rat, if you fidget with this thing constantly, the lock bar will keep moving over and over and over and over. Any knife does. Eventually, if you keep flicking a knife over and over and over and over, you will eventually get blade play, or I'm not saying it'll happen fast or anything like that, but eventually it's going to happen. So certain knives you want to, stick to fidgeting with, and then some, you might not want to do over and over and over and over constantly all day long fidgeting. Okay, so this is what I've based it down to. Okay, so a budget knife should last you 1 to 2 years. And I'm basing that on the type of steel that budget knives come with, how often you have to sharpen it, and all these other things we've talked about. Basically, you're either going to sharpen it past its level of where you're going to want a new knife, or it's going to start getting blade play. You're going to start seeing wear to where you're either going to have to modify it or mess with it, or possibly just get a new knife. Now, if you're working with that knife, cut that time in half. So it'll be 6 months to a year. A mid-grade knife, 2 to 3 years. And this is all with use. So a mid-grade knife with a mid-grade steel should last you 2 to 3 years. Now, if you're working with that knife, cut it in half. So let's say a year to a year and a half, possibly 2 years. Now the mid-grade steels, I'm saying 14C28N all the way up to 154CM, possibly even like N690, steels like that, D2, stuff like that, more the mid-grade. Now D2 starting to get down into the budget range, and sometimes these prices, they're interchangeable. But I'm just going with mid-grade materials, and I'm also thinking, like once you get to titaniums and stronger locks and stuff, where you would get in the mid-grade range. So now high-end pieces that do have M390, and K390, Maximet, stuff like that. And the high-end steels, high-end materials, titanium frame locks, nice big lock bars, nice big stop pins, big hardware, all those things. 5 to 10 years with regular use. If you're working with it, cut it in half. 2.5 to 5 years. If it's your work knife. That's the way I based it down, and I broke it down, and I actually looked at a lot of the knives that I've worked with, and I thought about how long they lasted me with a lot of use. I've done this with some of my work knives. I've done it with some of my budget knives that I've worked with, and like a budget knife, in all reality, when you actually work with it, it does not last you very long. It just really doesn't. Like even this one, I worked with it. This is a $30 knife. I've had to fix the lock bar. You see it's almost at 100%. I've gotten lock rock on this thing twice. Oh, and it's already, it's not that bad, but I got a little bit of play already again. Now that will be the third time I've had to do it. And the second time I didn't do anything but flick it a bunch of times. So, it wound up getting it one time. I got rid of it. And now it's back. I mean, but those things happen, especially like I said, if you know, when you're working with it hard and using it hard. Now, if you're just cutting little stuff and it's just your EDC knife and you're just opening it up, cutting little stuff, eventually you're going to have to sharpen it, and it's going to be based upon how long your blade will last and how much you fidget with it. So that's the time I think basically about what they should last. Now, I know there's going to be, you know, differences and stuff like that, because, you know, there's so many knives now and so many different price ranges and everything else. So, but there you go. And I was basing budget knives on like the $20 to $40 range, and basing mid-grade between like, well, $20 to $50 range, I guess. And I was basing the mid-grade like $50 to $100 range, and then high-end, you know, $100 to $500, you know. Even, you know, maybe $150 to $500, because like I said, there's so many different variations. Like this, you know, I got this for $100, but somebody else might have paid $140 for it. This is M390 in titanium, so, you know, there's lots of nuances. But there you go. Peace.